I'm Aaron Crawford. I'm here for the Center for Presidential History, and I'm interviewing Rachel Brand. The date is September 18th, 2015. Could you tell us how you ended up in government service, and particularly the counsel's office in the White House in 2001?
Mm-hmm. Well, I was involved in the recount in Florida. So I had been working at a small law firm called Cooper, Carbon and Rosenthal in D.C. before the election. And as you know, a large number of high-profile lawyers from D.C. were flown down to Florida on both sides of the aisle. And among them was Mike Carbon, who was one of my bosses, and he took me with him down to Tallahassee. So I was not counting ballots out in the counties. I was in the Republican Party of Florida headquarters in Tallahassee, writing briefs and filing things in the Florida Supreme Court, and got to know the folks who ended up doing the hiring in the White House counsel's office. So I started working for the White House counsel's office during transition before the first inauguration.
And what were your responsibilities in that office? What does it mean to be in that position?
The office is, well, the counsel to the president obviously is he's not the president's lawyer in a personal capacity, but he's the lawyer for the office of the president, right? And at the beginning, when I first started to work there were 8 associate counsels, 8 or 9. And, we provided legal advice on everything you can possibly think of. And so we, just for practical reasons, we divided up the portfolio among us. And so I handled the 25th Amendment, which is the succession of the president in case of the president's death or disability. I handled those issues. I handled all issues related to the president's appointment and removal authority. So who can he appoint or fire in the executive branch? That was very interesting. I had certain agencies assigned to me. I had the Department of Energy, the Department of Health and Human Resources, OPM, and a whole bunch of other smaller agencies. And then I worked on judicial selection, which all of us did, all of the lawyers in the counsel's office worked on judicial selection. And I was responsible for finding candidates and vetting candidates for federal court vacancies in a number of states. So I had, 8 or 10 states that I was responsible for, both the district court and the court of appeals. And I was involved in vetting Supreme Court candidates, to be ready for the possibility of a vacancy on the court.
Okay, well, let's start with the first slate of candidates. President Bush announces them on May 9th.
Mm-hmm.
And before this, there had been talk in the press that, Governor Bush's record appointing justices was rather moderate. So there was some speculation that this could be maybe an easier process than expected. How would you, what was your involvement with getting that first slate ready?
Mm-hmm.
And your reaction to the reaction to those nominations?
I'm trying to remember who was on the first slate. I remember the event. They were all standing on risers in, I think, the East Room.
John Roberts would be the...
Roberts, Miguel Estrada. I probably don't want to talk about my involvement in vetting specific candidates, but I was certainly vetting. There were lots of vacancies, right, as there usually are when any president's elected, because at the end of an administration, the confirmation process tends to wind down, especially if the Senate's of the opposite party. Then there's sort of a pent-up number of vacancies there. So we were all doing a lot of work on judicial vacancies. And I remember that was, it was a fairly aggressive timeline, right? To come out with that large slate of candidates that early in May was viewed as pretty forward-leaning, which was intentional, right? The president had said during the campaign that he took judicial appointments seriously. It was very important to him. And in terms of the reaction, of course there was opposition, but I don't think it was anything surprising, really. I mean, the judicial appointments have become contentious, and there were some contentious ones in that slate, just as there are all the time. But if you have a more specific question about that, I can talk about it.
Well, first, let's talk about, I know you don't want to talk about specifics, but maybe what are some of the criteria when you're actually looking at the type of judge you want for the district court, who you want for the appellate court? I mean, what kind of process are we looking at?
Well, you can't ignore the role of the Senate in the appointment, in the nomination process, right? So, we in the counsel's office had there was no written list of criteria that we looked at in vetting candidates, but we had a pretty good sense of what the president wanted in terms of judicial philosophy, so that was very important. And then, of course, you need a certain level of experience. You need a certain character. You have to be able to pass an FBI background check. So the process depended on which court you're talking about. So for district courts, President Bush asked senators from the home state to give him a slate of at least 3 candidates. And I don't know if you've talked to other interviewees about the blue slip process and why the president has to involve the senators at the very beginning. But, understanding the reality that a senator has a blue slip prerogative, you have to, if the president wants to get a nominee confirmed, he has to take the senator's views into account before the nomination. So, if I were, putting myself in my shoes back then, I had a vacancy in, I don't know, just say Alaska, I would be on the phone with the offices of the senators from Alaska, talking with them about who's the senator. Does the senator have candidates? Does he want to give the president a slate, or does he not? They'll do usually. Who does he have in mind? Can you please give us more than one? Don't just try to force the president to nominate the person that you want. And it'd be kind of a back and forth. We would also oftentimes go out and do our own research and maybe come up with some candidates that we found on our own outside of what the senators gave us. We'd interview them. We'd interview the people the senators gave us. We'd be in the White House counsel's office. I would be in those interviews along with the counsel to the president. And somebody from the Department of Justice often would come as well from the Office of Legal Policy. And then, we would make our own judgment and consult with the senators, and then we'd go to the president. We'd have certain set appointments with the president to talk about judicial appointments specifically. So some of us would go in there and say, Mr. President, we recommend that you nominate so-and-so for the District of Alaska. And then he would say yes or no. And then after that, then the FBI would go off and do its background check, and that whole more regularized process would happen.
Okay, and you mentioned this, that these were contentious before, and certainly in the last year of the Clinton administration, the blue slip process was already kind of experiencing some issues. But it's after this first slate of candidates when you start to see Democratic senators arguing that now ideology has to be not just a factor, but maybe the factor. I'm thinking particularly of Senator Schumer's editorial in the New York Times in June. So it does seem to be very different in that respect, and particularly that now district court nominees seem to be caught up in sort of the partisan politics where they hadn't before. So I guess I'm kind of wondering, does this alter the way you have to get these people through the process? And there's one in particular, appellate nominee, which is Miguel Estrada, which seems to be really contentious. So through that summer of 2001, it seemed to me that the process of judicial nominations has changed.
For me, because I wasn't fighting the fights of judicial confirmations during the Clinton administration, it's hard for me to compare what it was like during the Bush administration to what it was like beforehand. But there certainly were Clinton nominees who were contentious. Elena Kagan didn't get confirmed at the end, for example, just as John Roberts had not previously. I'm sorry, tell me your specific question.
Well, I'm talking specifically about this summer where...
Oh, the concept of ideology. I mean, one thing that does stick out in my mind, ideology became a dirty word. It was very weird to me. There were sort of outraged questions from members of the Senate Judiciary Committee about whether you were considering, ideology. Well, okay, then call it judicial philosophy. Just call it something else if ideology is a dirty word. But the president obviously wants to know what approach a nominee is going to take to the business of judging. That's what judicial philosophy is, and why that would be somehow outside the bounds of propriety, I have no idea. I mean, it's the most important thing. So, I do remember that phenomenon you're talking about, but that frankly faded away. Later on in the administration, nobody was expressing any outrage that the president would take judicial philosophy or ideology into account.
Yeah, and it seems to me the argument kind of morphs out of, these are going to be ideological judges, to senators starting to argue that they're being cut out of their advise and consent process. I think
it was much more. The president would be more likely to find himself in a contentious situation with the senator over a district court nominee if the president ignored the senator's desires about who to appoint than over some ideological question, because the senators really view those appointments to be almost their own. To an extent that, frankly, as a former lawyer for the president, I think goes a little too far. But because of the history of the Senate and the way the Senate's procedures work, they have a pretty much absolute right to say no. to the any movement on a nominee from their state, and so the president has to take that into account. And that's really dealing with the senators and their preferences is a really central part of the process for those nominees.
Okay. Well, in that first year, I think that the Estrada nomination seems to be kind of different from all the rest. It sort of draws a lot of the kind of harsh rhetoric from kind of both sides, and he's stuck in limbo.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain exactly, why that was, or why you thought it was that Estrada had sort of evoked these kinds of feelings?
I'm not sure I want to go into the details of Miguel's nomination. I mean, it's very hard to say in retrospect why, for example, Bill Pryor was confirmed to the 11th Circuit despite his very outspoken views on abortion, and Miguel wasn't confirmed. These things sometimes are just sort of the vagaries of history and politics, and lots of little circumstantial things move the ball in one way or the other. So I don't know. I mean, he was clearly viewed as a conservative. He was probably viewed as a potential Supreme Court nominee since he was Hispanic. He's very, very smart. I think the opposition's always going to have their eye on anyone who they think might be a viable Supreme Court candidate. And I think some people just didn't like him, but I don't know. I'm not sure I want to go into more detail than that.
Yeah, that sort of becomes, as I'm researching, you kind of miss maybe how personalities themselves play a part in all of it. So I guess the next logical question would be that Estrada is just one of 10, 12 people who aren't getting through to a vote, and President Bush renominates them, some of them several times.
Mm-hmm.
Explain that strategy. I mean, it seems to be, of course, Congress changes hands, but President Bush seemed to be very persistent in some of these nominations, very specific nominations. Why exactly was this?
I'm trying to remember. You should ask Al Gonzalez that question. He was probably the one talking to the president about it. I mean, I think the president wanted to send a message that these were important, and he wasn't going to be backed down that easily, right? But it's hard for me to even remember the sequence of exactly when the nominations were. The Senate goes out of session, and they get renominated. How many times that happened? I'd have to go back and look at the history there.
Well, let's talk about you were in the associate councils. You were associate counsel to the White House, but you eventually end up in the Justice Department. Can you explain or describe that change?
How I ended up being there. Yeah, it's a little bit more indirect than that. So I left the White House. I loved my job at the White House. I would have stayed for life if I could, but I got a Supreme Court clerkship. I went to clerk for Justice Kennedy, and so that's why I left. And so then that's a year-long stint, as you probably know. And at the end of that, I decided I wanted to go back into government, and so I started to look to see what in the administration was open, and ended up going to be the Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General, which is a very long way of saying I was the number 2 person in the Office of Legal Policy at DOJ. And that's the office, at least at that time, that ran DOJ's role in the nomination confirmation process. I later became the head of the office.
And President Bush had revived the office.
No, it had existed the whole time during Clinton. L.D. Atchison was the assistant AG for all 8 years, but they called it something different. They called it the Office of Policy Development, but it was the same thing.
So they were doing essentially the same job.
Yeah, the thing about OLP is that it's an office that there's no role that must be performed by it, right? There's no statute that says the Office of Legal Policy shall do such and such. It really depends on what the Attorney General wants it to do. So in the Clinton administration, it did have a role in judges. It did have a role in policy. It was a little bit different. In the Bush administration, it really was the central locus of policy development for the Department of Justice. So no major policy anyway could go anywhere without coming up through OLP. And then it also ran judicial confirmations and did some other things. But that's at the discretion of the Attorney General. That's just how it happened to work in the Bush administration.
So maybe describe the differences of your role in those two offices, essentially on the same issue, same project.
The easiest way to explain it would be that the DOJ and the White House, this is all specific to the Bush administration, of course. It's quite different now, as I understand it. But the White House counsel's office and the Office of Legal Policy would work together on all judicial nominations throughout the entire process of every nomination. But the White House would take the lead before nomination, and DOJ would take the lead after nomination. So if you took, nominee X, the White House counsel's office would be the ones to call up that person and say, would you like to come in for an interview? The White House counsel's office would be talking with the senator's office if this name, for example, came from a senator. Or if it didn't come from a senator, the White House would be calling the senator and saying, could you live with this person? Now, a lawyer from Justice would usually come over and go to the interview, but the interview would be at the White House and it would be arranged by the White House counsel's office. The lawyers of the White House counsel's office would go to the president and say, Mr. President, we recommend you nominate this person. At that point, pretty much all of the work would get handed off to the Department of Justice. So the Office of Legal Policy would work with the FBI to do the FBI background check. Lawyers at the Office of Legal Policy would do a very thorough vetting. So they would, a specific lawyer would be assigned to each nominee. And if I were doing it, I would be calling up the person's colleagues, opposing counsel, judges in the district, maybe the U.S. attorney, former colleagues, everyone. It's sort of like a background check, but more focused on professional credentials than have they ever, broken the law, which is what the FBI is focused on. And then you write a report, and then once all that happens, then the nomination is made. So all that vetting, so the tentative decision to nominate is made, then all the real vetting happens, and then the actual nomination is made. And then the Office of Legal Policy runs the process of getting the person confirmed. Except in very contentious nominations, and the White House Ledge Office would get back involved and so forth. But for run-of-the-mill nominations, the White House wouldn't have a whole lot of involvement after the time of nomination.
Okay, well, just in the interest of sort of mechanics, because we hear a lot about nominations, but it's interesting to kind of hear the process. Now, in the Justice Department, that means you probably are working a bit with Congress.
A lot with Congress, constantly.
Exactly.
The Senate specifically, obviously.
The Judiciary Committee,
right?
Specifically.
Right. Well, but also the leadership or home state senators, depending on the circumstances.
And what were some of the things that you were, there's some obvious issues about confirmation, but what are some of the things that you did on a regular basis? As far
well, some of it's just mechanical. There's a lot of just procedural work that has to be done. Every nominee, every committee in the Senate has its own procedures, but the Judiciary Committee has a very extensive questionnaire for any nominee that goes before that committee. So, I've been confirmed by the Judiciary Committee twice, and I had to fill that thing out. It's very intrusive, frankly. It's even worse for judicial nominees, so they have to fill out even more information. So, for example, if a person is already a judge and they're being nominated to another judgeship, they have to list every single decision they've ever written, that kind of thing. So the Justice Department helps the nominees do all that paperwork, and they help facilitate them getting the paperwork up to the Senate. Justice would facilitate the nominee going up for any meetings with the senators, courtesy visits or meet and greets, that kind of thing. If there's, there's a lot of sort of broader strategic work that goes on with the Judiciary Committee leadership about the schedule, the timing of hearings, scheduling, can we get more nominees through? There are all kinds of conversations going on. It's sort of a daily communication with the Judiciary Committee.
Now, in the first 2 years, when the Senate is under Democratic control, the contentious nominations are stopped really in committee because they have that power. But in the second 2 years, with the Republicans in control, the Senate, it moves to the floor, and we're talking about the filibusters now. Was it something you anticipated, and how exactly, how did you deal with this issue? Because it becomes contentious is probably too light a word on some, particularly in congressional politics. Explain sort of how you had to deal with some of those issues.
Well, it totally depended on the circumstances, right? Every case is sui generis, right? There's discussions, there's negotiations, there's sometimes you break log jams by making a deal specific to a particular state. So just to take, for example, Michigan, as you know, the U.S. Courts of Appeals, besides the D.C. Circuit and the Federal Circuit, they cover multiple states, right? So Michigan covers, or Sixth Circuit covers Michigan, Ohio, et cetera. just in the state of Michigan, there were 4 Sixth Circuit vacancies at the same time, which is mind-boggling. And Senator Levin wouldn't allow any of them to move forward for a very long time. And ultimately, President Bush came to an agreement with him where one of those nominees was withdrawn, and that person was nominated to a district court. And then somebody of Senator Levin's choosing was nominated, and that's how the logjam was broken. But that's that case, right? Every case is different.
Right. Well, it seems to me like if you're running through the process, and particularly if you're guiding nominees, it sounds like very closely through a lot of hurdles. The decision to actually filibuster, particularly, Estrada was the first, and almost 6 times they tried to break the filibuster, but there were several others. I mean, did you know, as you got through the process, that this wasn't going to be, very successful? And then when they're renominated, did you have to, go back, make the same kind of connections? If Estrada's nominated twice, but some of these
I didn't personally work on Estrada's nomination, so I'm like, let's put that one to a side.
Well, there's others who are nominated, 3 times.
Yeah. I mean, but again, it's depends on the circumstances. There's a judgment made about whether the person can ever get confirmed, and if it's truly futile, then you might make a judgment not to renominate, because after all, the nominees, you're not dealing with pawns on a chessboard. You're dealing with individual people whose careers and lives are being put on hold, right? So it's, again, it totally depends on the circuit. But there was an agreement reached, you probably remember, after which Brett Kavanaugh and several other sort of controversial nominees were confirmed. But again, it just, that was able to be done because of discussions and negotiations that were specific to that particular circumstance. I can't generalize, is what I'm trying to tell you.
Well, maybe your impression on, looking at the politics of this, it seems to me it would have to have an effect on whether people actually decide they wanted to do this.
It does. Yeah, we were turned down by people who didn't want to be considered for judgeships because they didn't want to put themselves or their family through that process. That happened numerous times.
So,
also, people turned us down because they didn't want to take the pay cut.
Okay. That's very interesting.
Fewer of those, but that I can remember. But
well, maybe we could transition to talking about the Supreme Court.
Okay.
And when the administration began to prepare, not to say that it's obvious, but this had been the longest period of time, I think, in 180 years, where there had been no vacancy. So, what was the administration anticipating, and how were they preparing?
Well, we had been preparing since transition in 2001, like I mentioned earlier. So even when we were still in the transition offices before the inauguration, folks in the counsel's office were starting to work on just a list of potential people, right? Because you could have a vacancy literally at any time, and the president can't not be ready for something like that. So a list was developed, and then, in the very early days that I was at the White House, every one of us lawyers was spending a lot of time vetting in great amount of detail individual candidates. So, if I'm not going to say who I was vetting in particular, but each one of us had was assigned 1 or 2 candidates that were considered particularly viable to look at in depth. So if you had, for example, somebody who was on a court of appeals, you'd be reading every single opinion that person had ever written, which is very time consuming. And then I'd be doing it at home late at night usually. And then writing up a sort of a lengthy vetting memo about that person. And so, a lot of work was done on, and then, less work was done on some longer list of people that was considered perhaps not as viable. But that work was being done already in 2001, and then it was sort of kept fresh over time. So when I left the White House counsel's office, I handed off my memo on candidate X to the guy who replaced me at the counsel's office. He kept it fresh. He handed it off to somebody else. They kept it fresh. So, that work was ongoing all the time. And then, at the end of every term, historically, except in the case of death or something like that, a justice usually announces the retirement at the very end of the term. So at the end of every term, everyone's sort of waiting with bated breath, right? And we were waiting with bated breath that year. That was 2005, right? Just like we had been the year before. We did not think it was going to be O'Connor, though. That was, frankly, a shock to me. And I think, others being honest, they would say it was a shock to them also. but we had a lot of work done on a lot of people, so we were ready to go with candidates. But then, of course, the discussions started to happen, which I'm not going to go into, to really narrow it down to a very, very short list of people that the president would actually interview. So you can ask me more specific questions about that if you want. But
there's one question, that I'm very curious about. In that the last vacancy, we're talking 1994, 11 years. It doesn't seem, maybe in the scheme of things, not that long, but you have something very different. You have the internet, and you have social media issue that you hadn't had before. Maybe tell us maybe the way you prepared for that, or what surprised you about this, because there are some real grassroots efforts on both sides when it comes to these nominations.
Well, there's a lot. So there's, of course, the whole process until the president, announces the nominee. There are so you're very prepared for a nomination. You're prepared for every potential line of attack that might come against the nominee. At least you think you are. So, for example, we prepared these on multiple candidates because we didn't know who the president would pick in the end. But we had binders and binders of talking points on every potential issue that could come up. But even when you're that prepared, there are certain things that we decided we couldn't be prepared for, because looking into them might be a flag that we were considering a potential person as a Supreme Court nominee. So, for example, we hadn't. So, in the case of Alito, for example, Roberts. So, Roberts had worked in the White House, and Roberts had also worked in the Justice Department. And of course, there were records in the Reagan Library about him, which hadn't yet been released under the Presidential Records Act. And then there were DOJ documents in the National Archives under the regular retention schedule for Attorney General documents. He had worked directly for the Attorney General. We had not looked at the records in the National Archives, because to ask the National Archives for all the records about John Roberts would be a pretty clear flag that we were vetting him. And so we actually had to very hastily review all of those documents after the nomination and quickly go through them and identify everything controversial, and then get ready for what we anticipated might be attacks on them. So all that work is going on. But then, as because of Rehnquist's death and then Roberts' renomination to be Chief Justice, it's quite a long time between his initial selection and his confirmation. And throughout that entire time, we had a 24/7 war room media response operation happening out of my conference room at DOJ, and it was looking at the internet, the blogs, the TV, the newspapers, everything, which, you wouldn't have had to have that many people working on it probably in 1994, just because the volume of stuff to look at was presumably much less, because the internet wasn't what it is now. So, we had that constantly. And so, folks would be lawyers in my office, and interns and all sorts of people were helping out, looking at all of that. And then if they found something, they would tee it up. And then I was on the phone with the press all the time during the process, but I wasn't the one deciding which reporter I would talk to. The press office sort of like put me in front of this reporter or that reporter, but there was a constant effort of responding to questions that came up and trying to get our affirmative message out too. So, for example, the day after each of the nominations, all the reporters who cover the Supreme Court and related topics were invited to come into DOJ, and I sat down and sort of gave our proactive, here's our talking points, here's what we think the record is, here's some of the cases you might hear about, and sort of getting that affirmative message out too.
Well, one of the most obvious issues with Roberts' nomination is sort of the identity politics, the fact that there wasn't the nomination of another woman to replace the first woman on the court. I guess I'm curious, where that issue, fit into deciding who to nominate and how you actually handle the nomination.
Well, the president wanted to appoint the most qualified person, and he picked, the president picked John Roberts, right? It's his personal choice. It's not like anyone told him who to pick, and he interviewed several people personally. The gender politics thing went away as soon as Rehnquist died, and frankly, it just became a lot easier to get him confirmed as Chief Justice, because not only because there was no gender politics issue, but also because Rehnquist was a conservative, and it was sort of perceived that you got a conservative replacing a conservative, so this is not going to move the needle on the court as it would have been. It was perceived to be if he had replaced O'Connor. So, not that it was easy, but it felt easier after that.
Well, I think most people would agree that the Roberts nomination went smoothly, and his, particularly his testimony was so well done. The curiosity is, how do you prepare someone for that experience, which has to be, daunting, particularly the recent history of these things.
Yeah. Well, a lot goes into it. There's sort of two. There's hearing prep, and then there's prep for all of the other interactions with the Senate. So I guess take sort of each in turn. The hearing prep, the way we did it, was that we had a series, and I planned out the schedule and sort of looked at the calendar, and there were it's a 4-week period. We held a moot 4 days a week for 4 weeks, so there were 16 moots, and they each lasted 4 hours. So, I don't know, it was like 9 to 1 or whatever we did, 8 to noon, whatever it was. They got Wednesdays off, but Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday for that 4-week period, they were in moots in roll in my conference room at DOJ. And so the way we would do it was, just looking at the days on the calendar, I sort of looked through all the issues that I thought would come up. And some of them are obvious topics like abortion's going to come up, the First Amendment's going to come up, the Commerce Clause is going to come up, I don't know, substantive due process, all the kind of basic constitutional issues, stare decisis, what's your judicial philosophy, all that stuff. So, you might have a day on First Amendment speech, and then you'd identify subtopics. And the way you'd identify that I anyway identified topics is, first you look at the nominee's record, and if he had written an opinion, a controversial opinion on the First Amendment, you'd assign somebody to ask about that. You'd sort of look at the different lines of doctrine in that area and make sure somebody was ready to cover every important line of doctrine. You look at what the press was saying, if there's some First Amendment thing in the press. Senators were writing the nominee letters in some case, like Senator Specter sent several letters saying, I intend to ask you the following questions. Well, then you're going to make sure you cover that, obviously. And then, you'd have 4 or 5 lawyers from DOJ and the White House assigned to be the mooters on any given day. And they were all assigned their subtopics on the First Amendment, say. And then it would all be in roll. So I wouldn't play Senator Schumer or Senator Specter, but I would play generic senator, and it would be Judge Roberts asked the question, and then he would respond, thank you, Senator, for that question. So it would all be in roll like that, and we would do that for a couple of hours, and then we'd break, and then we would start talking about it. And we would never tell the nominee what to say, but we would point out, well, if you answer that, then the follow-up question could be this, or do you really want to say it that way, or can we think of a different way to say it? So we would do that on every topic. So you take the generic constitutional topics, and then you would be really sure to cover all of the specific controversial issues in their background. And then, of course, there are certain non-legal topics like, whatever happens to be in the nominee's background that people might want to ask about. And so that was the hearing prep. We did one moot for each of them that we did over at the White House. That was all day long. And we assigned lawyers to play every one of the, I think it was 18 senators on the Judiciary Committee at that time. So 18 lawyers playing 18 senators. Like I would play a specific person. And that was towards the end of the process. And then the other part of it was preparing the nominees for the courtesy visits. And this is an understood, underappreciated part of the process. I think Roberts might have met with 99 of the 100 senators, something like that. And in certain cases, I think he met with Senator Schumer 2 or 3 times. And these would be one-on-one meetings. A lawyer, happened to be a lawyer, but a person from the White House Legislative Affairs Office would accompany the nominee to those meetings. So I didn't go to those meetings. But every day, you'd have your moot in the morning. And then at about 5 o'clock, we'd go over to the White House and we sit down with the nominee, with some of us from Justice and some folks from the White House, and talk to the nominee about what meetings he was going to have the next day. So he would go to the moot, and then on a typical day, he would go to a bunch of courtesy visits on the Hill in the Senate. And then at 5 o'clock, we'd come and we'd debrief from the meetings of that day, and then we'd prepare him for the meetings for tomorrow. And those meetings are important because I think for a lot of senators, getting a sense of the person in that individual meeting is just as important as the hearing. And for senators, most of the senators are not on the Judiciary Committee, right? So these courtesy visits are their opportunity to kind of take the measure of the man, and see what he's like in person. So we would talk to the nominee about what the senator cares about. Different senators care about different things. You're likely to be asked about this. Make sure that you don't say anything in the courtesy visit that you can't also say in the hearing, because the discrepancies are bad. So we would do that every night. And also the downloading, the debriefing from the meetings that the nominee had that day was extremely useful to us in predicting what would be asked about during the confirmation hearing. So it was kind of a two-way street during those meetings.
It seems extraordinarily complicated. You're asking someone not only to be the expert on the law, but they're having to retail politic here. They're having to actually, in essence, win someone over in face-to-face interactions. What's your ideas on the process itself? Is this a way to really assure the best, or that the person with the right qualifications are there?
I would not. It is painfully political and has become vitriolic and nasty in a way that nobody wants. But this is a democracy, and the Constitution provides that the non-political branch of government will be selected by the political branch of government, which is the political check on the judiciary, right? So, the idea that it should be taken out of politics is ridiculous to me. It's supposed to be political. It's the president and the Senate, right? The democratically elected branches of the government that do it. And what's the alternative, right? To have some supposedly nonpartisan expert body that drops from heaven appoint? No, that will never happen, right? It'll be some group of people not elected by the people with their own biases picking the judges. So how's that better? I think it's worse, frankly, because you don't have the political check on.
Well, it's a good segue into the next nomination, which was Harriet Miers, and which, as most would agree, if the Roberts nomination was, expertly done, well done, the Miers nomination was the opposite. Now, the first question is, were you surprised by the nomination of Harriet Miers to the Supreme Court?
I'm not gonna go there.
Okay. We'll explain a little bit about this process with her. In some ways, it seems very unfortunate, maybe in some of those situations that she's put directly in these types of political meetings, and by some accounts, it didn't fare well. I'm very curious about your take on the politics of this nomination.
Well, there are a few, I think, things that caused that nomination to fail. The main political one was that I think Republicans were not sufficiently prepared for the nomination. I'm not going to go further than that, but the president has to have the support of his own party to get a Supreme Court nominee confirmed, and with the political environment on Supreme Court confirmations, he didn't have it, so that was a problem. And I don't know that was a problem with the nominee, but it was a problem with the situation. The other two issues were that being a Supreme Court nominee is a full-time job. You heard what I just described. They're in there all day, right? For Roberts, the D.C. Circuit, he had some opinions he had to get out, but he kind of got those opinions out, and then he could focus on the Supreme Court confirmation process. He didn't have to actually hear cases. The Third Circuit basically gave Alito a leave of absence or whatever during his confirmation process. So they didn't have a full-time day job, either of them, during the process. Harriet did. She was White House counsel. It's really hard to prepare for a confirmation hearing and be White House counsel at the same time. So I think that was just hard for her. It was, and it was hard for us, trying to get on her schedule and things like that to prepare her. But I think ultimately the real straw that broke the camel's back was that because she was the White House counsel, Democrats in the Senate were trying to use her nomination as leverage to get documents and to extract all kinds of concessions from the White House that were very problematic. And you'd have to ask her why she decided to ultimately ask the president to withdraw her name. But I think the fights over documents and privilege and that kind of thing were becoming really problematic. And that was because she was the sitting White House counsel, not because of, I think, anything else about her.
Well, I mean, through some of the other interviews and the research, it seems kind of apparent that they certainly weren't ready. Republicans weren't, in particular because so many issues, particularly from here in Dallas, come out. And it seems to me the president's out trying to make this nomination for two reasons. Maybe one, there is the gender issue, but also trying to appoint somebody who has a very different experience. And with what you've just told us about the process, it seems to preclude anyone else. I mean, is that...
That's interesting. Yeah, I do think, and of course we have Elena Kagan on the court now, and she, right, and she didn't come from the Judicial Academy, as they say. I think it would be good to have more people with a real practical experience as lawyers on the court, and we certainly shouldn't restrict viable candidates to people who have been in the business of judging for 20 years before they are nominated, because a lot of the cases the court decides have to do with the way law is applied, rules of procedure, and things like that. I mean, the reason that people go to Court of Appeals judges and maybe state Supreme Court justices and so forth is that they have a record to be judged on, and if you want to know what you're getting, the best way to know what you're getting is to look at their judicial record.
It seems like there may be a catch-22 here in that, you have a record, you know what you're getting, but the more record you have, it seems to be more difficult to get
well,
through
that's
the
true
process.
too. That is right. That's the downside. Yeah.
Although Alito sort of kind of turns that on its head. But.
Yeah, we were able to he had 15 years of judicial opinions on the Third Circuit, including some very controversial ones, and now it was a Republican Senate, right?
Right.
But nevertheless, it was very contentious and a lot of hard work to get that done.
Well, I want to go back to Myers in that seems to be the moment when it becomes really clear to the American public of all of these different outside forces. In this instance, it's particularly Republican grassroots groups who are not sure that her religious credentials are up to snuff or whatever. Could you maybe kind of explain, and you could or you don't have to answer if you don't want to, but the role of outside groups in this process? And we know that the president decided to end the pre-screening by the American Bar Association, but the Democrats would argue that the Federalist Society had too much influence. And then, of course, throughout 2004, 2005, we hear of the Four Horsemen, the outside people who are advising on these nominations. Could you, if you would, maybe kind of explain, and particularly in some of the groups of the Myers nomination, how do you deal with that kind of thing where you may not see that coming?
Well, I'm going to speak very generally here, not about Harriet's nomination. So I was in the White House counsel's office when the decision was made to end the ABA's sort of preferential treatment in terms of their involvement in the judicial selection. So let's just be clear about what that decision was, okay? For a number of years, the ABA had been given names before nomination, and they have something called the Standing Committee on the Judiciary or something like that, which is a group of ABA lawyers who vet candidates. There's one for each court of circuit. And they would come up with a rating, well qualified, qualified, or not qualified for each prospective nominee. So during the Clinton administration, they got the name before nomination. They came back with their rating. Clinton nominated people that the ABA had rated not qualified, okay, and they were confirmed. So it's not like the ABA's ratings have been taken as dispositive across the board in the past at all. What the Bush administration did was to say, the ABA can vet these people all they like, but they don't get preferential treatment inside the White House process before nomination. So the only difference was they had to wait till everybody else found out who the nominee was, and then they went and they did their thing, same as before. They did their vetting, they gave them a WQ, Q, or NQ, and then the Judiciary Committee decided that it was going to wait to hold a hearing until the ABA's process was completed. So there was really no change, practically speaking, except that they were, one private organization was not given what I view to be an inappropriate sort of preferential treatment inside the government process. So that's all it was. People make a big deal about it when I think it's making a mountain out of a molehill. But when we were vetting people, we would have conversations like, oh boy, this person's not going to get a Q from the ABA. I mean, that was a factor, right? Not because we really cared what the ABA had to say, because we could probably judge qualifications just fine on our own, but the Senate was going to care what the ABA said. And so, or at least it would be used, if the person was otherwise controversial, that not qualified could be used as a talking point against them, making them harder to confirm. So that was certainly a practical political consideration.
And it seems that the ABA decision also is directly responsible for the increased questioning about the Federalist Society among a lot of these nominees. It does seem to me it does become something of an issue by the end of the first term, where
no group, including the Federalist Society, had anything remotely approaching the role that the ABA had. That's just not plausible.
So we're talking about just pure politics in these instances, where these are tools essentially to be used by the opposition.
I mean, there were allegations that you're asking, but sure, lots of people in the process. If you're out there looking for candidates, if I had say the District of New Jersey or something, and I was trying to find candidates, I would call tons of people and say, hey, do you know anybody in New Jersey who'd be good? And I'm not going to not call people from the Federalist Society, but they didn't have any kind of preferential role. But I can only speak from my personal experience, right? There are lots of people involved in the nomination process, but for me, I was not relying on them as my go-to source of names for vacancies.
Well, I don't know if we're finished talking about Myers yet, but did you try to do the same things with her that you did with Roberts?
Yeah, we started the process. We were doing moots and
okay.
Yeah.
Now, how do you transition out of a failed nomination? I mean, maybe explain that experience. What do you do after something doesn't work like that?
You just keep going. I mean, you got your list of people, and you serve them up to the president, and he makes the next pick. I mean, there was really no.
So you just go to the.
It's not like we all had our heads on the floor and couldn't function. We just did the next thing. I mean, it wasn't.
So you have all of these nominations, all of these nominees prepared to some degree. You have everything there. So you go to the next qualified person.
The president had to make a next independent choice. It wasn't like, after Harriet withdrew her name, there was still a decision point then. It wasn't like the president had already made the backup choice or something like that. He had to then decide who he was going to nominate. But we had already vetted extensively many people, so it wasn't hard to kind of move that process right along with the material we already had.
Well, explain the process during the Alito nomination, because it was more contentious than Roberts, and for a host of reasons. So, how did it differ?
The process was basically the same. We did the same number of moots, same setup, same kind of procedure, same with the courteous visits. They worked the same way. We actually haven't talked about another part of the Senate process, which is the initial rollout of the nomination. So, for example, Roberts was announced at night. I think Alito might have been announced in the morning. I can't remember now. But so Roberts, in the case of Roberts, he's announced in an evening thing in the East Room, and then in the morning he's brought very visibly with people with White House Legislative Affairs people again from the White House to the Senate. He meets with Senate leadership, Judiciary Committee leadership, et cetera. And then that was done for all the Supreme Court nominees. And then and in the case of both Roberts and Alito, I cannot remember now if we had this for Harriet or not, but there were 4 or so senators who are identified as I don't know what you want to call it, sort of special helpers or whatever, sponsors, people that had agreed to really take a leading role in helping convince their colleagues in the Senate that they should confirm this person. And so with Roberts and Alito, right after the nomination was made, I went over to the White House and sat down in a conference room with those 4 senators and gave them the full briefing on here's the nominee's record, here are the points we anticipate the opposition making, here's the response, et cetera. So those people were sort of especially briefed to help us with that. And then in addition to those people, both Roberts and Alito had what we called a Sherpa, which was a former senator. So it was Fred Thompson in the case of Roberts, and it was Dan Coates in the case of Alito. And they sat in on the moots, and they were very involved in everything. They went to many of the courtesy visits with the nominee and worked very, very closely with them.
Well, it seems one difference with Alito than the others is he's made a lot of he's written a lot of opinions.
Yep, he had. Yep.
And that seems to me that would just not only increase the amount of work, but makes things maybe a little more complicated.
Yeah, now we had read all of his opinions, right, before he was nominated. So we were ready for that. The thing that we couldn't do, and this just gives you an idea of how history changes things. Nowadays, courts of appeals publish decisions, and they publish unpublished decisions, right? And nowadays, you can get most unpublished decisions on Westlaw or Lexis anyway, so they're electronically available, and we had read all of the ones that were available like that. But because we've been on the court for 15 years, many of the unpublished decisions were not available electronically. And we couldn't go snooping around the Third Circuit without raising all kinds of flags. So as soon as his nomination was announced, we sent lawyers on the train to Philly to go through dusty old boxes of paper files in the Third Circuit clerk's office to get all of the other opinions, in part because we had to know what was in there, and in part because he had to produce all of them to the Senate Judiciary Committee in response to the questionnaire. So that was a lot more work in his case. And Roberts had some 50 opinions total on the DC Circuit. So that, just in terms of workload, it was a lot more work with Alito.
Well, Alito certainly drew a lot more political opposition. Can you explain maybe the basis of some of that and maybe how that changed the dynamics of?
Well, you have to remember, again, he was, just like Roberts had been in the beginning, Alito was nominated to replace O'Connor, and she was viewed to be moderate, he was viewed to be conservative, and so naturally people were worried about the Supreme Court shifting as a whole. And I think that factor alone was the cause of a lot of the controversy. I think if he had been nominated to replace Rehnquist, rather, it would have been less than it was because he was replacing O'Connor.
Okay. Well, the aftermath of successful Supreme Court nominations, you're left with the remainder of the second term. How would you maybe characterize?
Now, I left in the middle of 2007, just so you know. So the last year and a half, I can't speak to. But
what exactly in your remaining time there? In particular because President Bush was once again nominating some of the same people over and over. What may have changed, or what got easier, or how was it in the second term? Particularly, it's very different politically in the second term than the first.
I mean, in part, at the end of every administration, things start to slow down. That's sort of, if you look back historically, depends on how you slice and dice the numbers, but presidents have always had experience to slow down in confirmation rates at the end of administration, so that was a factor. We had some, which I don't want to get into in any detail, but we had some particular seats where we kind of experienced a stalemate with the senators about who would be an acceptable nominee, and so that was stalling the process even before the point of nomination, and that I think prevented President Bush from filling some of the vacancies at the end. I don't know, was there a specific thing you were thinking about?
No, I guess maybe in this, I did have some questions. I used the 9th District as, the obvious example, but you start to see more articles and things about the state of the court, the vacancies, courts that are overworked. And it's sort of frozen by a political process that won't allow that type of change. I guess maybe give me your thoughts on some of that through your entire
the Ninth
time.
Circuit is, the Ninth Circuit was a tough case. The Ninth Circuit's very big, for one thing. It's by far the biggest circuit in terms of number of states, land mass, geography, caseload, everything. And in some of the states in that circuit, there are 2 Democratic senators, and that always poses a particular challenge, right? Because the president wants to nominate somebody who reflects his view of an appropriate judicial philosophy, but you have to get them confirmed. And take California, for example, with Senators Boxer and Feinstein. It's hard to find a person who reflects President Bush's judicial philosophy that they would find acceptable, and so that political reality makes it hard. We got some folks confirmed to the Ninth Circuit in California, though. There was one particular situation in California that is really quite funny in a sad kind of way. This was the seat that Judge Trott vacated. Do you know about this anecdote?
I've heard a little bit.
So Judge Trott was a Ninth Circuit judge who had worked in the Reagan. He was appointed by, I believe it was Reagan, maybe it was H.W. Bush. Anyway, he had been working in D.C. in the administration when he was nominated. And he was nominated to a spot that was considered to be a California seat on the Ninth Circuit. But because no law says where in the circuit a judge has to have their chambers, there's now a recently enacted law that says there has to be at least one judge in every state, but that didn't affect this and didn't occur. It didn't exist then anyway. He went and put his chambers in Idaho. So he was nominated to a California seat. These are all informal. There's no law that says it's a California seat, but thought of as a California seat. He moves to Idaho. He's on the court for a long time, sitting in Idaho. He leaves the court. The Idaho senators give the president names. The president's ready to nominate an Idaho person. The California senators say, wait a minute, that's a California seat. And the inability to navigate that kept President Bush from getting anybody confirmed to that seat. Subsequently, as I understand it, during the Obama administration, Congress passed a statute increasing the number of seats in the Ninth Circuit by 1, so that now there can be an Idaho and a California, and that's how it was finally resolved. And someone apparently was eventually, this is after my time, but apparently is now sitting in that seat. So, there can be just some ridiculous situations like that that are outside the president's control.
Well, you read some of these, the assessments of the court that there needs to be, we need increased number of judges. We need more judges. But it seems like it would be almost impossible to get the number that's often asked for, 30, 40. And
new judges?
Yeah, and particularly that's in the district, but fewer.
Are you talking about getting 30 or 40 people confirmed to existing vacancies, or getting 30, 40 new judgeships? Oh, well, there's lots of things that go into that. Budget. That's a question that is way outside the sort of judicial confirmation.
Well, maybe in a
or it's much broader than that anyway.
Yeah, it may be in a broader sense. By the time you left, how would you rate the whole process, the confirmation process? As we said, I'm not sure who would want to go through it. Mm-hmm. But how would you assess maybe the change from the time you started, from the time you left?
I felt like it was about the same throughout. There were periods when it was easier. It's obviously easier when the Senate was Republican majority than it was when the Senate was a Democrat majority. But it's not like I felt like there was a noticeable increase in the politicization or vitriol from the beginning to the end. I personally did not perceive it that way.
Well,
I felt like it was hard throughout, okay?
I've read a lot, particularly from staffers, Democratic staffers in the Judiciary Committee, that they saw the process as completely turned upside down. The blue slip policy was pretty much
that has existed
defunct.
for administrations upon administrations. That is not at all a new thing. Don't let anyone tell you that. That goes back to Senator Thurmond and way earlier than that even. So it's,
Well, there is this sense, particularly from the political opposition, that something is broken by the Bush administration in this process. And, there's so much heat, so much political heat surrounding all of this. It's almost hard to know.
So wait, who is saying that there's heat from whom?
Well, particularly the people on the Democratic side, particularly people who worked in Congress, the staffers who seem to be very frustrated by, the whole system, the whole process.
And you think it's any different now for Republican senators with President Obama?
Well, I guess that's kind of what I'm asking, is it's all just a matter of,
I think it's about the same.
Well, is there anything else you would like to add to?
Let me think.
One question is, how would you assess President's legacy in this matter? In some respects, it's the most important thing he does. last beyond him. How would you assess it?
I mean, I think, I don't want to really talk about the numbers of people he got confirmed because you always wish he had gotten more people confirmed, right? But, I think that it's clear that it was very important to him. He took it very seriously. He made that very clear to all of us. And, I think he has a good record. I mean, sure, the president doesn't have that much control, honestly, over who he appoints to district courts and a little bit more courts of appeals. But within the room that he had, I think he has a very strong record.
Well, actually, I get this sense from reading, these people on Capitol Hill, and their problem is that maybe President Bush had a better hold on who he nominated and what he wanted out of the court. I don't read that Clinton had a lot of discipline in this matter, but that Bush had more of a clear idea and was more successful in executing.
I think he had a very clear idea. I mean, I don't want to overstate when I say that the president has no control over who he nominates, but it is. I think a lot of people fail to appreciate the power that senators have in who's nominated. They just focus on the power that senators have and who is confirmed, but there's a huge amount of sort of influence exerted in the pre-nomination process. I mean, one interesting thing, and I can't speak to how Presidents Clinton or Obama have done this, but President Bush was very clear that he wanted at least 3 names. If the senators were going to submit names, he was very clear that he didn't want them to just give one name. He wanted at least 3 names. And there were times when, we didn't go with one of the names for some reason, but that would be the subject of a lot of negotiation with the senator. But it's, to my mind, it's really in the best interest of everybody, including the senator, to give more than one name, because occasionally a senator will give a name and the person can't be nominated because of a background reason or whatever. And oftentimes what happens is the senator will give a name to the White House and it'll become public, either because the senator makes it public or it leaks out or whatever. And that's very embarrassing for the nominee if they end up not being nominated. There was one case, actually, and this was for a Court of Appeals vacancy, where a Republican senator held a press conference saying, I have nominated this person for the Court of Appeals. And he hadn't even given the name to the White House. So first of all, senators don't nominate anybody. And, he hadn't even given the name to the White House. It was one person. He announces it publicly. President Bush did not nominate that person to the Court of Appeals. That's a terrible situation for the not nominee, right? So, I mean, I think, he was quite adamant that he wanted more than one name. And maybe that differs from other administrations. I don't know.
Well, is there anything you would like to add?
No, I don't think so.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, my pleasure.